from last week is that in the biblical context, an idol is a functions in our lives rather than the thing itself. It means that be an idol for one person isn't necessarily an idol for another person, because it's how it functions in our lives, not what the thing is. It also means that a thing that starts out functioning exactly how God intended can take on outside for us and can over time turn into an idol. There is almost nothing in our lives that can't become an idol for us, given the right set of circumstances. So it's doubly important for us to keep watch, not just out in the world, but within ourselves. The perfect example of that is the story Kim read from 2 Kings about that bronze serpent that we've talked about before that Moses made. What wasn't in her translation but is in mine, they had a name for it by Hezekiah's time named Nehushtan, which literally means the bronze thing. It's a gracious name. So the bronze idol that King Hezekiah destroys, which Hezekiah is somewhere in the late 8th century BCE, that was actually a historical relic back from the days of Moses, which was some 4 to 6 centuries before Hezekiah. In the book of Numbers, notably after God has commanded the Israelites not to make any graven images, God tells the Israelites to go ahead and make a snake out of bronze and put it up on a pole. God promised that it would neutralize the venom from the snakes that were biting them in the wilderness. In the days of Moses, it was not an idol. God ordered the people to create it, and they did, and God used it as a channel to heal the people that were bitten. Across the centuries, however, the Israelites came to believe in that bronze snake more than they believed in the God who asked that it be created. They gave it the name Nehushtan. They began to offer it gifts and to burn incense to the thing. They transferred the credit for their healing from God to the bronze snake. And it was in that shift that it became an idol for them. The only way to get people to recognize that Nehushtan, again, literally thing of bronze, was not the actual source of healing, was to get rid of it at that point, so that the people could refocus on what was true. It was past its usefulness. That story is a perfect example of how a perfectly good, even a God-ordained thing, can become an idol for us if we are not paying attention. If this were a Sunday school class, I would ask you to break into groups and talk about the similarities and differences between what happened to that snake on a pole over its lifespan to the issues surrounding monuments around the United States that are being removed in some places or having laws to protect them in other places. Does destroying a monument or renaming a street really destroy history? Or is that like believing that destroying Nehushtan destroys healing? I imagine we could have a spirited discussion about that. Nehushtan shows us one sign of idolatry. When we begin to give credit for things God has done to something or someone else. It's not that others, human or otherwise, can't participate as a channel for God's work. I hope that that's what I do every Sunday, as I know every pastor does, and hopefully all of you do too. But to me, that's one of the most important points, the incarnation. The Word made flesh in Jesus. God works in and through the created order. But it's God's work nonetheless. And the virtue of humility begins with that recognition that It's God's work, however much we are called on to participate in it and however much it works. We lose that, we start to take credit for it, or we give credit to the thing, and humility is gone. The second story that Kim read, the story of the riot in Ephesus in Acts 19, also would like a word on this topic. While Nehushtan illustrates how the function of a thing can change over time, the riot in Ephesus gives us a close-up view of what happens when the power of an established idol is challenged. For some context, most of the book of Acts is a chronicle of Paul's efforts to spread the gospel through as much of the world as he could get to. Jerusalem, going out from there. While Paul's life initially was devoted to dragging out and killing the followers of Jesus, after his conversion, he realized that the God of his own Jewish faith represented the God of Exodus, the God of freedom and liberation, the God of love. And God and love could not be forced. So when Paul undertook the various missionary journeys described in Acts, he didn't just flip the switch on who he was persecuting. He didn't go from persecuting the followers of Jesus to persecuting those who followed other gods. None of that. He didn't go riding into cities to rail against whatever gods they worshipped or otherwise persecute those who worship them. He went to represent, both in word and in deed, the liberating God of Jesus he claimed to represent. That meant he presented to the people an offer and not a demand. To be sure, he was willing to debate anyone about him and to do so without apology. Most notably, he didn't burn the place to the ground. He just left and he went somewhere else. Enough were convinced he could. Those converts were not instructed to overthrow the other religions around them. They were encouraged to share their faith, but it was just that, sharing. To say, hey, here's why I believe this. Here's the difference it's making in my life. No force, no coercion, no violence. That is a mark of faith in the God of Jesus. A sign of idolatry is the exact opposite, which brings us to the story of that riot in Ephesus. In the first part of Acts 19, before we get to that story, we learn that Paul has been in Ephesus for a couple of years at that point. There is a story in that first part about a major book burning. But it wasn't Paul calling for that book burning. It was the Ephesian citizens themselves who were converted by Paul who decided, you know what, I don't want these books anymore. These books no longer represent what I stand for. And so the people themselves went through whatever they had in their own libraries and put it out there and burned them. They didn't raid the library teachers. They didn't threaten scroll merchants to get rid of books that ran afoul of their newfound faith. They went through their own stuff and got rid of whatever they thought might hinder their own spiritual growth. That first part of the chapter is also important because it tells us that Paul's efforts in Ephesus are working. People were actually changing their behavior and thinking long and hard about what like and what were their lives new. What Paul was doing, a material effect. Ephesus. And we know that effect lasted because Paul established a church in Ephesus, and the book of Ephesians in the Bible is his letter back to them from a later time. As Paul is feeling that the church in Ephesus is well enough established that he can move on to other regions, a silversmith named Demetrius, who made his living selling replicas of the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, gets nervous. If you remember your history, the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. That made Ephesus not only a religious hub, but a tourist hub as well. And Demetrius was one of the many artisans and craftsmen in the city who made a very nice living making and selling the merchandise to all of them. With Paul's increasing success in convincing people that the true God is not made by human hands, Demetrius gets concerned. He gathers his fellow artisans for an emergency meeting and says the quiet part out loud. This guy, Paul, is a threat to our business. His teaching that gods made with hands are not real gods is actually catching on. People are believing him. Worse, it's not only catching on this, but Demetrius sees writing on the wall. This new religion is a threat to their wealth and to the prominence of their city. If people come to believe that handmade gods have no real power, it could negatively affect trade with worshipers and tourists alike. And as he's telling this to his fellows, now it's not just Demetrius, but a whole group of tradesmen that are getting really worried about what Paul and Alexander and the others are doing. But they couldn't just go out to the people and say, hey, we're really worried about our revenue stream. Would you please ignore this guy and keep buying our products? No, that might fly with a few other people who were also making money, but it wasn't going to fly with the majority of Ephesians. So instead, they do what the protectors of idols always do. They sowed confusion and discord so that no one would realize what was really going on. Out into the streets they went, shouting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians!" And that confused people because nobody had heard anybody say that Artemis wasn't great. But clearly she must be under threat or these guys wouldn't be out there screaming, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." So they figured, well, she must be under threat then. And so off they go. People start coming out of their houses and soon everybody's angry and worried and ready for heads to roll. And they gather in the Ephesian Theater, an outdoor venue that could hold up to 25,000 people. They're all feeding off each other and all crying out, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." Paul wants to go out to talk to them, but the crowd is so worked up, the officials say, no, not safe for you to go out there. Verse 32 sums it up. Meanwhile, some were shouting one thing, some another, for the assembly was in confusion, and most of them did not know why they had come together. And that went on for over 2 hours. This kind of violent, angry, confused chaos is a sign that an idol is under threat. The confusion is key in that. The vast majority of people shouting in the Ephesian theater thought that Artemis was somehow, some way, being attacked. Artemis is not the story. The idol his buddies are trying to protect is their personal wealth, not the goddess of the city. But finally, Demetrius meets his match in a plain old civil servant, the town clerk. It was that faithful member of the boring bureaucracy who went into the screaming mob and told them the simple truth. Nobody's attacking Artemis. It was Demetrius and the other artisans who had a problem, and there was actually a system to deal with that. If they had a problem, there were courts, there were proconsuls, there was a system. They could go through all of those appropriate channels if they were having an issue. Artemis is not under attack. There is actually no reason for us to be here today. Once it's clear from the clerk that the threat to Artemis is a lie and Demetrius is exposed as a guy who's just afraid of a threat to his business, all the people who had just been rioting for 2 hours and who would have killed Paul likely had he appeared before them, saw the truth and just said, "Oh, a concern of mine," and they packed up their coolers and went home. We don't know Demetrius. The Bible never mentions him again. Lawsuit, or maybe he just kept making little silver statues to sell. The temple of Artemis in Ephesus continued to attract both tourists and worshippers until the Goths invaded and burned it in the year 268. And we know Paul's church in Ephesus survived and grew. The entire city of Ephesus was based on a lie. The lie was told because those who had a financial stake in the worship of Artemis had made their wealth more important than the religious freedom to choose something else, more important than the lives of those whose teaching might impact their balance sheet, more important than the peace and security of their city. The idols were not the silver replicas of the temple that they made and sold. The idol was the wealth of a small group of men and the status, power, and lifestyle that wealth provided. They were willing to risk the safety of the entire city and take the lives of Paul and his supporters and anybody else to protect it. Now imagine Demetrius had access to social media or his own podcast. What if he owned a media empire that stretched throughout Asia and could have broadcast to millions of followers, Artemis is under threat and the guy who's trying to take her down is coming to your city next. Be ready. Or, once the riot was shut down by the simple truth, imagine that Demetrius could, within seconds, spread the word to those who weren't there that the town clerk of Ephesus was allowing Artemis to be harmed and defamed, and that town clerk should be stopped at all costs. The foundation of all idolatry is the lie, because that's what an idol is by definition. It is a false god. If left to its own device, violence and destruction, all in an effort to distract and exposure of the behind the scenes. Attention curtain. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. Just during my lifetime, and just looking at this country, there have been constant of Demetrius and the Ephesian riot. In the earliest version I remember, the role of Demetrius was played by Philip Morris companies. Our infamous photo of the tobacco executives in sworn testimony before Congress in 1994, claiming each in his turn that he did not believe cigarettes were addictive, while also each to a man saying, no, they recommended that their own children did not smoke. Meanwhile, out in the theater, those companies and their executives sowed division, telling smokers that their enemies were non-smokers. And non-smokers, your enemies are those smokers. Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. Connection of smoking to lung cancer, and they protected their profits at the cost of millions of lives. They bribed politicians to do nothing about it. And then came the 1970s, when Exxon began doing important research on the effects on the climate. By 1982, the evidence from their work that, and I'm quoting from a 2015 article about it here, quote, Environmental Affairs Office circulated an internal report to Exxon's management which said that the consequences of climate change could be catastrophic and that a significant reduction in fossil fuel consumption would be necessary to curtail future climate change, close quote. It also said, and here I'm quoting from that internal report, there is concern among some scientific groups that once the effects are measurable, they might not be reversible. So that was 1982 that Exxon had that. So that's Exxon talking to itself in those reports. In 1989, when that news reaches Exxon's board of directors, with the caveat that combating climate change could lead to, quote, irreversible and costly draconian steps. The company sprang into action. They went full on Demetrius, shifting to funding any and all efforts to publicly question and even deny what their own research had been proving for decades. Which climate not only here, they have poured millions into the effort, and we literally may not survive the fruit of their idolatry. Since the Ephesian theater moment of January 6, 2021, a parade of civil servants, most of them Republicans, have been broadcast to the crowds to say, like the Ephesian town clerk, there is no cause that we can give to justify this commotion. But Demetrius has many more tools at his disposal this time. And the idol was allowed to grow much stronger. Many of the civil servants felt the need to wait and exchange the truth for a lucrative publishing deal before stepping out to calm those in the theater as the idol grew. I seriously doubt Demetrius died a poor man, but Acts 19 stands as a reminder that even a small group trying to protect an idol can put an entire city at risk, can put a country at risk, can put a planet at risk. It can also put the church at risk. But that's next week. Amen. And I invite you to turn again in The Faith We Sing to number 2128. Come and find the quiet center. Out of the theater into the quiet center. 2128.